Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Trollhunters Tales of Arcadia. Okay, so this episode, The Reckless Club, well, essentially the episode spoofs The Breakfast Club, if you can tell by the name. But this episode is kind of important because first and foremost, the B plot is mostly what's really, kind of important here. The story-wise, this is just all of the characters. This story-wise, this episode is a lot of the established characters and a new character that we haven't really met yet, but still, just kind of hanging out and screwing around. And because, that's what ultimately happens in the Breakfast Club. But there is a B plot that's kind of more important. It does, establish what's gonna happen. That's all of the things that happening with kind of the more episodic stuff, where not a whole lot happens in this season, does finally come to a head. So, yeah, in case this episode opens up with Jim and his team chasing after some gnomes who have decided to take Señor Uhl's truck for a joyride. And of course, that's kind of where the main conflict of the episode is. Obviously, Jim and his team, there's a bit of banter back and forth as they try to, chase after the obvious speeding car, and they eventually are able to stop. Arg is able to effectively stop the truck in its tracks eventually, with Toby's help, and of course they eventually do get the gnomes rounded up and put them in a sack with Blinky being instructed to take them back to the troll market, while Jim, Claire, and Toby decide that the best way that they're just going to have to get Señor Uhl's car back to him before he notices it's gone. Unfortunately, right at that moment, the police show up with Señor Uhl riding shotgun in the car with them, and of course the deputy immediately gets out and by this point, Arg and Blinky have since fled, because obviously trolls being out in the open, that they kind of can't do that. So they of course leave, and of course this results in Jim unfortunately being arrested. At which point the deputy asks Uhl if he would like to press charges, and Uhl gets out and admits that he actually will not be necessary because he has something more devious planned. A Saturday morning detention. And of course, this is just how the episode, that's just the setup for the episode. As it continues, Jim winds up in the room winds up in detention with, of course, with several other established characters. Of course, obviously, Claire's mom, Councilwoman Nunez, she's obviously annoyed about the fact that Claire is getting in trouble, because especially since she's met Jim, and of course Claire admits that it's not really Jim's fault and that she can get in trouble on her own without him. But of course Councilwoman Nunez doesn't buy it, and does instruct her to just be careful, to just be more careful in the future. Meanwhile, Jim and Toby wind up getting dropped off by Barbara, and Barbara, of course, scolds them about the idea that he shouldn't have done this because obviously she doesn't think that it's a good idea to steal someone's car while trying to impress to impress a girl. And of course, Jim points out that that's not entirely what happens, but and of course Toby tries to, of course, back him up, but of course Barbara doesn't really want to hear any of it, and points out that there's more important ways. There's better ways to actually get a girl's attention than just stealing a car. But also points out that she's not really all that mad about it, because she also starts joking with Jim as he leaves, telling him not to steal any cars on his way into detention. Which of course Jim obviously just kind of jokes back at her like, "Will do, Mom. Won't be doing any of that." At which point the trio proceed to meet up at detention, and they of course are very visibly, upset about the fact that obviously Claire's upset about the fact that they now have to spend Saturday morning detention. But of course, Jim points out that it's actually the opposite. Because they're in detention, they have vacation from whatever troll weirdness they got to deal with that week. So, of course, he points out that he's just looking forward to having detention and not having to, deal with whatever's going on with, you know, trolls and everything else. But of course he then mutters to himself that it seems like vacation is canceled when he sees Coach Lawrence drop Steve off, and of course Steve is obviously visibly annoyed about the fact that Coach Lawrence is dropping him off, and of course Toby is also visibly confused, pointing out that he didn't know that he's confused as to why Coach Lawrence is dropping Steve off. But in any case, they all head inside, and Eli was also similarly dropped off by his mom. We don't see him get dropped off by his mom, but he's also similarly dropped off. He just hauls a bye mom and then proceeds to go inside the school as well. But in any case, meanwhile, while everybody's just kind of filing into detention, it's at this point where Blinky, Arg, and Draal are kind of currently in Troll Market. They're currently waiting for they're currently just kind of waiting. They're just kind of waiting around, I guess is the best way to put it. And it's at this point where Vendel walks in and then tells him that he needs to speak with Jim. And of course, they point out that he's not there. Obviously, he's not around because he's in detention, of course, for quote unquote stealing a car. But of course Vendel points out that actually that there's a bit more to it than that, pointing out that Usurna is currently looking for him and trying to find him, and explains that she's trying to have Jim arrested for conspiracy, pointing out that she knows about the blood goblins and the gruesome that Jim recently fought, and does point out that there's a very high likelihood that she thinks Gunmar got out, and does have evidence for that, as well as knowing that Draal left his post, which of course none of the group really denies. In fact, Blinky points out that she can ask all she wants, but all he really wants is a pair of reading glasses, and nobody's been able to make them for him yet. So, but of course, when Vendel realizes that they do in fact know exactly what he's talking about, he becomes upset and does point out that they best find him and retrieve him and let him know what charges he's being brought up on. But of course, it's at this point where Blinky just points out the irony, pointing out that after all of this, he's finally found himself at the center of a conspiracy. But in any case, which is funny, which is ironic, but it's at this point where Draal ultimately decides to leave, and does point out that if Vendel is in fact right about how Gunmar has gotten out, that he's definitely going to need to look into that. So he of course immediately leaves to go and check the woods and make sure that everything's all right. But and he does want to gather evidence before something happens. At which point he does in fact leave. Meanwhile, we see Gunmar in the base with the Changeling army, and of course we find out that Blinky is Dictatious actually, but Dictatious is currently giving this fantastical explanation about this quote unquote visions, and about how he sees the world on fire, everything being destroyed, and when the sun clears, Gunmar is the one reigning supreme, and of course, this causes Gunmar to wonder how they actually go about with Dictatious's visions. At which point, Dictatious points out that ultimately it's Jim's friends that are going to protect him and keep him numerous. So he does point out that they're going to have to find a way to break through his guard, which of course is what Otto starts arguing with him, pointing out that that was exactly the same kind of plan that he had come up with, and accuses Dictatious of plagiarism, but Dictatious merely doubles down on his, divine seer shtick that he's trying to convince Gunmar of. Insisting that Otto dare mock the Pale Lady and the sights that visions that she's given him. But of course, Gunmar of course can't really take much of their bickering anymore, and is also hungry. At which point Otto offers him the cats, which of course Gunmar admits he's sick of cats, pointing out that that's the only thing that the changelings have offered him since he's arrived at the Janus Order. So with that, he decides to leave, even though Otto insists that he shouldn't go out because that would be a really bad idea. But Gunmar insists that while Otto may be his advisor. He is not. That doesn't mean he necessarily has to listen to him, and that he's controlled by no one. At which point he leaves. But in any case, it's this one where we do see all of the kids in detention. We find out that Mary Wang is there. We also find out that Steve and Eli are there, of course. Jim and his group are there, as well as a new girl named Shannon, who I don't think we've officially met, but she appears in this episode and gets a prominent speaking role in it. But in case, is this point where Uhl proceeds to explain the rules of detention. Essentially, the first thing he does is go around with a big box and collect everybody's phone, including him getting into a tugging match with Mary, who obviously does not want to give up her phone because she's the kind of person who, as we find out in this episode, carries around a backup phone in case something happens. We do find that out. Señor Uhl confiscates her phone. She just pulls out another one, and Uhl never bothers to collect it because he doesn't see it. So, but in case he then proceeds to tell them what the rules of detention are, is that until he dismisses them, they are to stay there and work on homework, and that is all they're allowed to do. And of course, it's at this point where Eli admits that he finished his homework and does wonder what he's supposed to do then. At which point, obviously, Señor Uhl tells him that he just stares at the wall, because if he has nothing else to do, then that's the only thing he's permitted to do. And this of course causes Eli to become very nervous. But of course, it's at this point where Jim, Claire, and Toby do start talking about detention, and they do point out that they're obviously very worried about what happened, and do point out that obviously they're nervous about what's going to happen, and they do admit that they feel like that it's kind of nonsense that they're serving detention for magical creatures or anything else. But of course, Jim points out that it's not really a big deal, and does point out that as long as nobody finds out what really happened, it should be fine. And of course, Eli overhears the entire conversation about how they're not actually talking about anything really specific, and of course Toby throws a paper at him to try and get him to mind his own business, but Steve merely chucks it back because obviously he and Eli secret best friends now. He's going to stand up for his buddy, but which of course Mary obviously notices the fact that Steve and Eli are being surprisingly chummy. So to kind of hide the fact that he actually secretly hates Eli's guts, or at least is pretending to, he proceeds to sock Eli in the jaw and knock him out of his seat, just kind of pretending not to hate Eli. And of course Eli points out that's a great way to hold their cover, but also points out that after hearing what Jim, Claire, and Toby had to say, starts to suspect that they may not be there on official business and may actually have detention. And of course, this causes Steve to admit that they seemingly ruined their perfect records for nothing. And they of course get really annoyed. They of course just start getting really annoyed with each other. But of course this is where everybody starts talking to each other while Señor Uhl is just kind of. He's kind of going around the room, and he's trying to figure out why he's trying to, keep his authority over them. But then he sees Then he sees Toby pull out a burrito, and of course, this is one of Toby's, Maximus Supremus burritos. The really spicy ones that caused Gatto so many troubles a long time back. Yeah, Toby's about to eat one of those for breakfast because he didn't have breakfast before he left the house. And of course, Señor Uhl starts talking to him about the burrito. And of course, at this point where Toby does admit that it is in fact his favorite burrito. And of course, this causes Señor Uhl to immediately confiscate it as a quote unquote eye for an eye thing. And of course, he does point out that if they're going to steal his truck, then he's going to take Toby's burrito. At which point he sits down, starts eating it, and tells them to continue working on homework and everything else. But also, in addition to doing homework, everybody else is also muttering to themselves. And of course, there's this point where Mary becomes concerned because nobody's talking to her, because she obviously she's a gossip, but nobody's talking to her and thinks that everybody's talking about her. But of course, Shannon offers to talk to her, and she's immediately shut down. But in case Señor Uhl does tell them to shut up and instructs them that they need to be quiet during detention, because he does point out that they shouldn't be talking to each other. But it's this point where as he's eating the burrito, which Toby anguishes about, pointing out that it took him 3 years to build up the tolerance for it, as he puts it, and obviously Señor Uhl is eating it down in one go. It's this point where we find out why Toby had to build up resistance to it, because immediately this causes Señor Uhl to immediately have indigestion because of how spicy it is, and of course he immediately has to go to the bathroom, where he's pretty much there for most of the remainder of the episode. And of course, everybody pokes their head out after Señor Uhl's been gone a while. They obviously point out that they should have been back, but they do note that that's concerning, that he's not back. At which point, Toby Jim offers to poke his head out and look for Señor Uhl, but of course we find out that Señor Uhl is currently incapacitated, and everybody comments about how gross it sounds from coming from the bathroom. And of course Toby points out that that's obviously because Señor Uhl ate something that he should not have eaten, because he did not have the tolerance to eat it. Like as Toby admits, the burrito had 3 whole ghost peppers in it. And obviously it's just tearing through Señor Uhl's Austrian stomach. So, of course, realizing that he'll be out for the rest of the day, they decide to make the most of that and just kind of mosey around the school and do whatever they want for the rest of the day. Because obviously they know that Señor Uhl isn't gonna be coming out of the bathroom for a while. So, they of course do proceed to immediately do that. Meanwhile, we also find out that in the process, we find out that Usurna has since gotten wise to the fact that Jim isn't around, and does wind up confronting Blinky and argue about it. And of course, she does confront them about the fact that she knows everything that's happened, and she is aware that they staged such a reckless rescue mission for Jim, and as a result of that, Gunmar may have gotten loose. And of course, Blinky and Arg admit that they don't know where he is. Well, more specifically, they do know where he is, but they point out that she's not allowed to see him because he's currently attending some important academic things. But she tells him that they can't hide Jim from her forever, and does point out that one way or another she will eventually scold Jim for his crimes, but and to make him accountable. But and with that, she leaves. Meanwhile, Draal is currently in the forest trying to find any evidence that Gunmar is currently out. And what he ultimately finds is a footprint, which of course causes him to become concerned. And he does note that it does seem like there isn't a footprint he recognizes. So he does start to wonder if it's true that Gunmar got out. But then his suspicions are confirmed when he hears a woman scream, and when he looks around, he just sees her car strung up in a tree. No woman in sight. Which and of course, this causes Draal to finally realize that there definitely is something going on. At which point, he becomes face to face with Gunmar, and does realize that Gunmar is in fact out. While Gunmar responds back that Draal is in fact a long way from Troll Market. At which point, the two get into a fight. Draal, of course, tries to fight back against Gunmar, but Gunmar is obviously more powerful than him and is a lot stronger. So Gunmar is ultimately able to overpower him, although Draal does put up a good fight. And also he loses his artificial arm in the process, but he winds up trying to drop the car that Gunmar lodged into a tree on him, but this does not work, and Gunmar is eventually able to overpower him, and does tell him that Gunmar does ultimately scold him, telling him that if he doesn't, that he should swear fealty and surrender. But Draal insists that he's not going to back down, telling him that he's a protector of Jim Lake Jr. and the Trollhunter, and he admits that he's not going to sit idly by while he watches Gunmar try and take over the world without Jim's knowledge. But after hearing that Draal is in fact Jim's protector, he decides that he can use this. And pulls and summons his Decimar blade and uses it on Draal. And meanwhile, Jim is, everybody else is since settled in the gym, and of course, everybody starts talking about what they did to actually get into the detention. Well, Steve starts throwing free throws, and is just, kind of also making fun of Jim, because he doesn't like Jim. He's kind of growing on, Jim's kind of growing on him. They're not exactly friends, but they aren't exactly enemies either at this point. They're just kind of annoyed with it. They're just kind of frenemies, I guess is the best word. Like obviously Steve knows Jim's a good guy at this point and is a hero, but he won't openly admit it to Jim's face. He's more than willing to make fun of him because he knows that Jim is kind of better than him. But in cases, it is at this point where everybody starts talking about what exactly happened. Obviously, they all start asking Jim if Jim and his friends, if they actually did steal Señor Uhl's car, and of course Jim to kind of keep his cover does claim that he did steal the car. And pointing out that the town is just so boring that sometimes you got to make a little fun for yourself. But of course everybody buys, even though it isn't true, and obviously Claire and Toby's reactions to being asked also proves it isn't true, but everybody just takes Jim's word for it. Meanwhile, they also ask Mary why she's there, and of course they insist that she insists that she was actually kissing Tight Jeans Hank under the bleachers and got caught, which of course causes Eli to immediately do a big old gasp. At which point he points out why she would actually make out with somebody from the rival school of Arcadia Oaks Academy, which is a different school to Arcadia Oaks High School. We never actually see it, but we never see Arcadia Oaks. We only ever see Arcadia Bay, but in case she does point out that he's forbidden fruit and that Eli wouldn't understand. At which point they ask why Steve is there, pointing out the obvious, in that he obviously, shoved some poor kid in the locker, and that's ultimately what happened. But Steve denies this, pointing out that if it ever occurred to any of them that he isn't just some one-dimensional character, and that he could be a good person, despite being seen as a bully. But of course Jim points out the hypocrisy of that, pointing out that he's still even though he's claiming to be a good guy, he is in detention. Which of course causes everybody to crack up, and Steve does kind of laugh alongside them, pointing out that he kind of walked into that one. But in cases at this point where obviously Shannon does point out that maybe they shouldn't really judge each other based on what they've done, and more so points out that ultimately nothing is really black and white, pointing out that in the end everybody makes their own decisions and make their own mistakes. The problem with them being in detention is that they are obviously not smart enough to not get caught. So she points out as long as they own up to their mistakes and admit that what they did was wrong, that they can ultimately kind of move on from that and grow as people. At which point we find out what she actually did to get in detention, which, as it turns out, was embezzlement. As we find out, she is the school treasurer. She's the student body treasurer, and she found out the hard way that there are limits to what she can and can't do with the school's funds. So unfortunately, she wound up getting in trouble for that, which is ironic, since she gives this whole impassioned speech about learning from your mistakes and all those other things and taking responsibility for your actions. But ultimately, it's at this point where they realize that it's almost 3 o'clock and they need to get back to class before Señor Uhl gets out of the bathroom. So they immediately retreat to go and retreat. But it's this point where Arg and Blinky come to find Jim because of Usurna's currently on a warpath for him. So he proceeds to tell everybody to go and that he'll catch up. Which of course Steve proceeds to throw one last foul shot before chucking the ball in Jim's general direction. And it's at this point where he asks Blinky and Arg what they're doing there, and they proceed to explain that Usurna is in fact looking for him, that she knows about all of the gruesomes, the blood goblins, Draal leaving his post, and the reckless escape mission, and that she's ultimately figured all of those things out, and that Jim is going to very much be in trouble when he gets back to Troll Market. So for that reason, they instruct him to kind of flee and cover it up, pointing out that they'll just lie about anything ever happening. But of course Jim points out that that's ultimately not a good idea, and thinking about what Shannon said, does point out that he'll take full responsibility for what he did. He'll own up to to his mistake, admits that he's done something wrong, and obviously, and that he points out that it'll be better if Usurna hears it from him than anybody else. And of course, Blinky and Arg do kind of think he's crazy for admitting to all the things he's done, but ultimately respect his decision. At which point they hear a noise coming from the hallways, and Jim immediately goes to check it out with and eventually what they discover is Draal. And they're of course confused, but of course it's obvious that Draal isn't really himself. Like, his eyes are weirdly glowing a bright blue, which of course causes Blinky and Jim to be a little confused at first, because they think that they don't know why Draal's there, and more importantly why he's charging at them. But Arg quickly figures it out, pointing out that it's not Draal anymore. At which point he pulls them to the side, and they quickly discover that that's going to definitely be some sort of trouble. At which point Jim immediately summons his armor and is unfortunately forced to fight one-on-one with Draal. He has no other choice. But of course, at this point, where the rest of the kids, led by Steve, ultimately try to go back to the classroom, but discover that Señor Uhl is no longer in the bathroom, and discover that he has since started drinking milk to try and cool off his systems, because the problem with hot spicy food, capsaicin. Milk neutralizes capsaicin. So he is in fact drinking milk to try and calm himself, pointing out that he can't feel his lips. But of course, realizing that they have no way of getting back to class now, they realize that they're going to need to find another way around. So they immediately duck behind a wall and immediately head toward the kitchen instead, with Steve deciding to break off from the rest of the group and tell Eli what's going on, pointing out that obviously he notes that Jim had to stay behind, and with Eli pointing out that maybe he's just a class, but Steve of course points out that there might be something more going on, and decides to go on a bit of a reconnaissance mission. And he proceeds to leave, tumble off out of the line of Uhl's sight, and proceeds to run off in the general direction of where Jim is. Meanwhile, Eli is currently trying to keep everybody in the dark by leading them into the kitchen, but of course, in the process, they do wind up running into Uhl again, who's now raiding the fridge in the school kitchen for milk, and is currently trying to find a way to get rid of the the spicy taste in his mouth. But then he hears Jim and Draal fighting, and realizing somebody is out and is currently causing problems. He immediately runs off to go and investigate. While Eli again tries to keep everybody in the dark, but claiming that Steve is probably back in the classroom with Jim, and that they should just go back to the classroom. Which of course causes everybody to become suspicious, but they ultimately decide to trust Eli, and he leads them back to the classroom while Uhl is distracted. Meanwhile, Jim is trying to fight the Gunmar controlled Draal. And he obviously does not want to do that, because Draal is his friend. He doesn't want to hurt Draal. So he is very much on the defensive while Draal tries and fails to beat the shit out of him. So and of course Jim is insisting that he doesn't want to fight Draal, and that he's not going to. But it is at this point where Arg and Blinky realize that Señor Uhl is on his way there when they hear him calling for whoever's in there to come out in the hallway to come out. So they close the door and barricade it, but quickly discover a problem that they're in a hallway with open windows, and the window and because the sun is currently setting, the light is currently sliding slowly toward them. So they kind of have to back into the corner as closely as they can to avoid the sunbeams, and point out that they can't hold the door forever, and that Jim needs to get ready to run. But and eventually he insists that he's not going to fight Draal, and it's at this point where Draal proceeds to pin Jim, and through Draal, Gunmar proceeds to mock him, pointing out that he should be it's pathetic that he can't fight his friend, and does introduce himself and points out that he reintroduces himself as Gunmar, and does claim that Draal is gone, and that ultimately, if Jim wants to fight, if Jim wants to fight, he will have to steal himself to kill this broken husk, as he puts it. But obviously notes that since Jim can't, that proves he's weak. But Jim of course insists that if Gunmar is going to fight him, then he should do so with his own hands. And of course, Gunmar insists that yes, he will do it, but he isn't going to fight Jim with Draal. He is going to, in fact, use his own hands to fight Jim directly. But and with that, he makes Draal leave, while Jim hollers after him, telling him to fight him, not Draal. Which of course. And of course, this causes Jim to kind of become distressed, because he now realizes that he's lost one of his friends because of Gunmar. It's essentially, Gunmar has taken Draal for himself, and of course, this causes Blinky and Ark to reconcile with him after Uhl leaves and decides to take another way around. But while Blinky does point out that they are absolutely going to have to figure out a way to save Draal, he does point out that for the time being, they need to get Jim back to class before Señor Uhl finds him. So, it's at this point where Jim does proceed to run back to class, and of course, Señor Uhl does see Jim run past, but doesn't actually see his face, and wonders who's out there. At which point, the two proceed to get into a mad dash to get back to the classroom. And eventually, Uhl seemingly makes it back to the classroom first, but then Jim sneaks in behind him and hides behind the door, claiming that he was just sharpening his pencil. Which, of course, Señor Uhl is obviously very visibly pissed about the fact that whatever happened is obviously somebody obviously got out, and does proceed to start questioning people to wonder who escaped, pointing out that if they don't come forward, they will have massive detention. And of course he eventually decides to pick on Eli, because he knows Eli is a good kid and with a bright future, and will absolutely will try to alleviate himself of detention if he can. And of course, but Eli, much to his credit, doesn't give in to Uhl's pressure, and does tell him that nobody left and that they aren't supposed to leave the room. Which of course causes Uhl to become frustrated, but does admit that he actually has proof, revealing because in the process of chasing Jim, he did discover the damaged lockers from his fight with Draal. And does insist that somebody had to have done this, and that it couldn't have been nobody. But of course, at this point where Steve reappears, and having snuck off to watch Jim's fight and make sure and come back, does point out that in disguise, so Jim didn't recognize him, of course, but he does disguise. But there is a thing where he leaves, disguises himself as the mole, comes back, and does try to keep an eye on Jim, and just keep an eye on Jim. He does claim that whoever did it was obviously from Audio Oaks Academy, and does cover for Jim, pointing out that he hates their rival school very much. Which Uhl, of course, realizing that none of them are actually going to confess, and believing that it might actually be just a delinquent prank of somebody sneaking in and just dismantling the lockers when nobody's there, ultimately decides that they're free to go, which of course everybody takes and celebrates, while Uhl is just puzzled and frustrated that their lockers are now damaged and that they need to be replaced. But of course, it's at this point where Jim proceeds to tell Toby and Claire what he saw, what happened, about how he fought a Gunmar possessed Draal, and Toby is visibly surprised because he didn't realize that does confirm that Gunmar is out. But of course, it is at this point where Jim points out that Toby should know all of this because he was the one in the hallway. But Toby says that no, he wasn't the one in the hall. He wasn't the one in the hallway. He points out that it wasn't actually him. But Claire then proceeds to point out that it's obviously had to have been Steve, because he was the only other person who have left during that time when all the chaos broke out. So they do point out that, so she does point out that it likely could have been him, which of course causes Jim to become concerned because he's realizing now that Steve knows his secret. But is at this point where he winds up getting confronted at the bottom by by the Jeep trolls. They show up. They show up. They immediately surround Jim, and Jim, Claire, and Toby all summon their weapons at first. But it's this point where Usurna appears, and having apparently, and it does bring Jim in on the charges of, you know, conspiracy, letting Gunmar out, and forsaking his duties as Trollhunter, and does have him arrested and dragged off. So that's where the episode ends. But yeah, obviously this is the episode where something weird is obviously happening with Usurna, because they explain that Usurna knows all the things that Jim has done, and apparently has just been making a case for him. But they never explain how she knows all of this. It is clear. But it is clear, additionally, that obviously Jim is kind of fighting alone, because Gunmar brings it up when he confronts Jim as well. That the tribunal is against him, and Jim notes that's weird because Gunmar shouldn't know any of that. So there is definitely something weird, and there is definitely something that isn't quite making sense. So yeah, that's kind of what sticks into people's head. But yeah, next week is gonna be, I think, one of the more divisive episodes, for at least from a discussion standpoint. I will be getting to that one next week. But for the time being, yeah, this is a fun episode. It's a fun spoof on the Breakfast Club. It's great, but it also does kind of point out that, yeah, there's something weird going on. Gunmar's clearly out. He's taken over Draal, but also he has information that he shouldn't have, which is also weird. So of course, this is obviously, there's obviously more going on, because they do explain that there's a spy in Troll Market, but don't explain who it is. Like, there's a whole bunch of weird stuff going on that will make sense soon. That will be explained next episode, the next episode of the episode after, I forget which. But yeah, there's definitely some weird stuff going on. But in any case, that's gonna do it for my review. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It helps support me. I would appreciate that. Be sure to go and check out my Twitch. I stream Saturdays and Sundays over there, as well as over here, so please go check that out. Go and check out my Discord as well. I like to hang out with people over there, so please go do that. And also, if you want to see more content from me, first and foremost, check out my Patreon. It does help support me. I've already brought that up. But also, check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent video. It may or may not be this video. Whereas the bottom video is a video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you want to try something new, or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace. That clicker so we can all watch a movie or something. It's got to be around here somewhere, right? We just need to find it. Oh, why didn't I think of that? Then search this place top to bottom, and then I vote we play games up on that big screen. Yeah, it's like our old little treasure hunt. Everyone grab a corn and start searching. I'm in. Alright. Hey, you agree to my plan,